Hi, this is Debbie from CorpU, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Positive Leaders Radically Outperform Their Peers, with our featured panelist, Kim Cameron. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Should you have any issues during the webinar, please use the question box and I will assist you. Today's event will be recorded and shared at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Alan from CorpU to get us started. Alan?
Thank you, Debbie. Welcome, everyone. We have a really exciting presentation today, and Kim Cameron is one of the greatest unsung heroes with the best untold story, and you're going to find out some pretty incredible things today. Kim's a professor at the University of Michigan's Ross School and their Graduate School of Education, Associate Dean at the Ross School. He's a Fulbright Scholar. So I'm really excited about positive leadership and what we're going to learn today. And I'd like to build a bridge for you to help you situate this. So our mission is to help you. I want to teach you how to win at learning, not to just climb the learning curve, but to build an organization that shapes the learning curve. And if you're the kind of leader that wants to do that, to build an organization in which people can expand their capacity to create value and achieve the results, then you need to be someone who creates the conditions and shapes the environment. And today we're going to talk about what that looks like through structured dialogue in a positive environment. And Kim Cameron is one of the world's foremost authorities in the world of positive psychology in the research in the academic sense. And so super excited to have him today. And just to sort of connect us to that, we talk about structured dialogue to create that environment. So structured dialogue, what is that? And just getting to its root, it stems from the Latin roots, dialogos, shared meaning flowing through a group. And if we're going to build a learning organization and we're going to win at learning, we better figure out how to win at structured dialogue. And this is, of course, a concept in terms of dialogue that's been around for thousands of years, back to the days of Socrates and Plato, but popularized in 1991 by Peter Senge in his book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. And he showed some evidence about how getting from vision to shared vision, it happens through dialogue, not through monologue. And so structured dialogue, the way I like to think about it and the way we think about it at CorpU, it's about connecting people in purpose together in purpose-built groups to have them solve complex problems, generate and spread ideas, teach and learn from each other and from experts, both inside and outside the company, and to create new knowledge and transfer it across the enterprise. And so organizations that figure out how to do this are those organizations that are going to win in the future. And so the key, once you create structured dialogue, is there's so much more powerful analysis of structured dialogue. So think about the difference between a traditional survey, it's kind of the old way, as a result of this course I'm ready to give positive feedback, or on the example on the right, which is from a real example from CorpU, just de-identify, but imagine connecting people and they say things like morale is so low given the layoffs, or balance pushing the teams versus assuring them, or we're not very good at that, we need weekly meetings on the big picture, I think it frees us to do more midweek course corrections, or I'm struggling how to handle the bonus issue. So imagine if you can create that dialogue, and then you can do with big data techniques, big data analytics, discourse analysis, so using machine learning algorithms and sentiment analysis, you can start to see into the hearts and minds of your people and your culture in ways that have never been done before. So as we think about, do you have a positive environment? I think we go back to, I love this equation by Kurt Lewin almost a century ago, but behavior is a function of people in their environment. And I think all too often people think that teaching and learning intervention, sending people off to training, that's going to change them, and they don't shape or change the environment within which people come. And so I'm just reminded of the metaphor of the dirty fish tank. If people have a fear of failure, or looking bad, or losing their job, or saying something that would cause them some humiliation, shame, guilt, whatever, that's an environment in which you can take this little fish out and send them off to training at the best business schools in the world. But eventually, if you bring them back into this environment, eventually those new skills, attitudes, mindsets, beliefs, behaviors, they're just not going to take hold. And so one thing that is critically important to all leadership development, to all organizational learning, all of it is only as good as, do you have a positive environment in which people feel virtuous and safe? And today's speaker, Kim Cameron, so in addition to his regular bio, these are some of the things that I think are incredible. For instance, the Academy of Management. Every business school professor and business and leadership researcher in the world belongs to the Academy of Management. So when they gave him the Sustaining Research Award for Organizational Development last summer, I thought that was a really phenomenal accomplishment. And he's the Impact Award for Major Impact on Real World Management. So Kim's not the kind of guy that does scholarly research that doesn't make a difference. He's actually the person that bridges theory to practice in a way that no one has done. So anyway, so that's Kim, and we teach the Practicing Positive Leadership course here at CorpU. You can see all kinds of pages of this course. Was a great motivation for me. I recognize behaviors in my team, and I have ideas on how to more fully engage them. I receive valuable insight into positive leadership. So all kinds of great examples. It's eye-opening. It opened my eyes. It opened my mind. Valuable insights. These are essential building blocks to grow you as a leader, to empower your team. So these are all real-world examples of people who have taken our 3-week Practicing Positive Leadership course with Kim, and Kim's going to share some of those techniques with us today. And I would encourage you, if you don't have either of these two books, these are probably the most powerful books. The prose is extraordinary. They're concise, they're tight, and they really can change your life, and they can really lead you to changing yourself and your team and your organization. So, and I'll just give you one quick example. I carry around a stack of these little books, these notebooks, these journals, and I write in them every single day. And they're not just gratitude journals. You hear about that, but these are journals that I take my notes, I write, I reflect, I write everything, and I've been doing it. I have stacks and stacks and stacks of these. And every time I get to a new book, which happens probably every 120 days or so, I open to the back page and I write the 8 Dimensions of Virtuousness by KC, and that's Kim Cameron. And so just one very simple example of something that I do, that I open the book every day, I read the Dimensions of Virtuousness, and I try to remember to practice these every day. And sometimes on a regular basis, I share them with our customers. We share them with associates here in the company, put them up on big screens. But it's just a matter of every day, I've got to look at this, and that's how I start my day. So with that, we're going to do a quick poll, and I'm going to turn it over to Kim. So if you all would be so kind as to vote on our poll. Our positive leadership and positive practice is applicable mainly when things are going well. In other words, don't do these things when times are really tough. We're going to give you about 15 more seconds to vote. Votes are still coming in. Keep voting. Their numbers are changing. Are we good? Ready to close the poll? Okay. Look, oh, they're still voting. 2 more seconds, 3 more seconds. Get your votes in, folks. This is great. Great participation. Fantastic. Debbie, when you're ready, let's close that poll. Kim Cameron, I'm going to turn it over to you from here. Give us your thoughts on the poll and lead us on to the next phase of our conversation today.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I just have to tell you and tell the folks online that you're a hero for me and have been. I got acquainted with CorpU, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. I'm not sure how long ago, but it's the single best online education development company program technology that I know of, and I really mean that. It's just extraordinary. You have been a hero for thousands of lives, Alan. So I am really flattered and thankful to have you include me in this webinar this time. One of the things that I often, you're welcome. One of the things I often encounter is some senior executive in some company or some organization will say, look, Cameron, this word positive is a little too soupy and syrupy for me, too touchy-feely. And frankly, I got profitability goals, I got productivity, I got to worry about share price and, hitting targets. And I just can't get deflected with this. It's just a side trip for me. And especially, for example, if we're downsizing or if things are really going south and we got real financial pressures. I mean, General Motors, there's a couple of big community events in Michigan this next week, having people talk about what's going to happen when they close this plant with 20,000 people losing their jobs and so on. Well, when those kind of circumstances occur, is there any relevance at all to what we refer to as positive leadership? So I'm not going to have time in our brief time together to talk about all of the research we've done, but one of the circumstances that we have especially sought out is what happens to organizations when they're downsizing, when they're facing especially turbulent financial times, when things are really uncertain. Does this work or not? So what I'd like to do, instead of giving a general answer to that, what I'd like to do is start out, Alan, by telling some stories about some organizations, each of whom faced a pretty difficult situation. So we picked this first story, we picked an industry where we thought the least likelihood of positive practices, positive leadership, any of this stuff we sometimes refer to as virtuous practices, this is going to be the most irrelevant thing you can imagine for this industry. And so we picked financial services. Financial services is an industry like Wall Street, for example, that has a very clear objective. And that objective is show me the money. I need to make certain I get financial return. So this next slide, Alan, shows you one of the businesses within Prudential Financial. Now, Prudential Financial, you may recognize that name, multinational organization. Financial services organizations like Prudential have to have a thriving retirement business. If the retirement business is not doing well, the entire organization is going to be in trouble because that's where people put their money. I mean, retirement funds are the most important funds for most people as they consider their own families and their own future. Well, Prudential was struggling. Their retirement business was not doing particularly well, and they decided that in order to do well, they needed to expand their scale and scope, and the best way to do that, they thought, was to merge with another retirement business. The company they selected was Cigna Retirement. They described that as similar to merging the Yankees and the Red Sox. That is, one of these companies was in New York, one of them was in Boston, and they said they hated each other, like the Yankees and the Red Sox hate each other. But they had really little choice. So they created the merger. And of course, you'd expect culture clashes, you'd expect low morale, and so on. The CEO of Cigna became the CEO of Prudential Financial. His name was John Kim. So Alan, would you flip that next slide? John Kim said the following. This is simply a quotation from John. He said, look, implementing positive practices, positive leadership practices. And by the way, we got involved with John very early on, spent 2 or 3 years with him and the company and his senior team. He said this was initially seen as just being positive, smiles. It became clear, however, he said, that this was a significant change. There's no end, no final grade. This is about changing our culture, our strategy, and our approach. This is not a destination or a conclusion, but a process. And then here's what's interesting. He said, I know that we'll have succeeded when customers and employees see us as above average in all the technical aspects of our business, but then by succeeding above all understanding. We're so good, people cannot even understand how in the world we got that way. Then he continues, we don't debate about how we're going to get there. We just take initiative. If I wanted to stop this movement, I couldn't. It's way beyond my control. People are doing things now that are self-perpetuating. That is, at a very difficult time in their history, they said, all right, positive leadership is going to be a way we're going to try to address this problem. So next slide, here's what happened. So not only was the merger successful, and they kept 95% of their clients. I mean, how do you turn your enemy into your friend, you know? But from substantial losses in the retirement business to 20% annual growth rate in an industry where the growth rate, by the way, is 4 or 5%. So times 4 or times 5 industry growth rate. Opinion surveys went up. It's now the largest business within Prudential. And what was really the interesting test is John then he left Prudential and became the president of the world's largest insurance company. That's often a test because you say to yourself, okay, well, this is sort of the program, it's sort of the baby of this CEO. So once he leaves, things will crash. Didn't crash at all. His successor just continued that trajectory. And today, Prudential Financial is thriving. Prudential Retirement is thriving. Well, one of the people brought in to help with that merger was a person named Jim Malazzi. Jim, because he learned a lot in this Prudential Retirement merger business, was then appointed to be the CEO of another one of the Prudential businesses. It was Prudential Real Estate and Relocation. So flip that next slide, Alan, thank you. The problem with this part of Prudential Financial was that they were losing, at the time Jim was appointed, $70 million. The year before, they'd lost 140. Now look, if you're in financial services and you lose $210 million, I mean, things are not going in the right direction. So Jim took over. A couple of months after he took over, he called me up and said, come help me. So here's what he said. In fact, that next slide gives you a quotation from Jim. He said, look, when I took over in the fall of 2009, we were facing a $70 million loss per year. The year before, we'd lost $140 million. And then he said, I hearkened back to my Prudential retirement days and what I learned about positive organizational scholarship. That's the term we use for this general area of research. And there's nothing magic about that term. That's what we call it. The message was, he said, let's look at what we have as opposed to what we don't have. Let's look at what we can do as opposed to what we don't do. How do we start to take the limits of our company? Not in terms of just going back to where we were 2 years or 5 years ago, and then here's what's interesting. How do we achieve something that's truly great and never seen before in our industry? Nobody's done this, and that's our aspiration. Then he said, look, we implemented a variety of positive practices and tools. The results, he said, were astounding. So next slide shows you what happened. So they won the J.D. Power Award for Service. Now, that's the national award in the United States given to one company every year. And in this service industry, they won the J.D. They were the best service provider in the industry. 93% of the employees were trained in 80 days. And there's a whole story to tell about that, but we helped them identify what we referred to as positive energizers, turned them loose on the organization. And in 80 days, 93%, and we're talking about tens of thousands of employees worldwide, had been trained in this new way to think, new culture. Employee opinion surveys goes up. They went from $70 million in the red to $20 million in the black in 12 months, 2 times business plan. And what's interesting is, after about 3 or 4 years, Warren Buffett's firm, Berkshire Hathaway, bought this business from Prudential, and the stock price in this business was about twice the parent company stock price. That is, they were doing far better than the parent company. In other words, in a very difficult situation, we're losing a lot of money. Things are going south. Jim relied on positive practices, positive organizational scholarship. That's the empirical base and the theory that explains why it works, in order to make a turnaround. So they were doing exactly the opposite of what you normally think. Instead of putting it on the shelf saying it's too soupy and syrupy for me, it was the competitive advantage. Okay, so now one more story. So you'd say, okay, well, fine. I got one anecdote or a couple of anecdotes about businesses that have done well, but What about in other kinds of organizations where there's real unionism and there's bureaucracy and it's tough to do anything and it's really hard to change? So this next one, thanks Alan for the slide, this next story, and it's the last story, is about the Rocky Flats nuclear arsenal. Now, 16 miles west of Denver, Colorado, there's a place called the Rocky Flats Nuclear Arsenal. This place was started in 1951 in order to produce the triggers that went in the nuclear weapons that the United States was producing during the Cold War. See, the Soviet Union was stockpiling weapons. We had to stockpile weapons. They had 70,000 nuclear weapons. We had 24,000. But that was enough to keep the world safe for democracy. I mean, if somebody's going to shoot a missile toward us, they knew they were going to get one back toward them. Well, 3,500 people working on this in this site. And you notice on that very top picture, in a very top of that picture, you see the Denver skyline in the background, and in the foreground is Rocky Flats. So it's not very far away from a big metropolitan area. They're dealing with the most dangerous materials known to humankind. I mean, transuranic acid, plutonium, enriched uranium, and so on. So you don't want to make any mistakes when you're handling that kind of stuff. So the bottom photo on the right-hand side of that slide shows you these people working in glove boxes. See, this is radioactive material, so you have to be protected from the material. And then you see in that one fellow is handling a little tray there, and it has plutonium in the tray. He's going to put it in that container right below it, which contains nitric acid. That's how you keep plutonium stable. Well, the trouble is nitric acid eats through things. So over time, you have to recycle this back in a production process on an annual basis. Well, excuse me, the Department of Energy is handling it. The Atomic Energy Commission has jurisdiction. And as you expect, it's an incredibly tight, secure environment. You don't want terrorists to get a hold of any of this material. And the problem is that plutonium has a half-life of 26,000 years. So once you have it on site, it is not going anywhere. Okay, well, the next slide, Alan, shows you that over time, these people became masters at producing nuclear triggers, but what they weren't good at, and in fact, nobody was paying attention to at all, was monitoring pollution. Nobody knew if the groundwater was polluted. Nobody knew if there was any kind of dust that was being emitted into the air or in the smokestacks that would be carried by the wind down into Denver, and people in Denver were going to start having cancer after 20 years. Nobody knew that. See, the reason for that is if you get a particle of plutonium in your lungs, you will get cancer, guaranteed carcinogen. So the EPA began suing in the federal courts saying, wait a minute, somebody's got to pay attention to this. It took them 40 years to get partial jurisdiction because it was such a secure environment. And in fact, you notice that top photo, there are 3 levels of razor wire around this facility to keep people out instead of keep people in. And then the bottom photo shows you on a bi-weekly basis, people would show up and chain themselves to the front gates, lie across the road so trucks couldn't come in and out, protesting war, protesting nuclear weapons, and protesting the fact that it was in their backyard. Well, the EPA got partial jurisdiction, showed up in 1989, but to the surprise of everyone, they brought with them the FBI. The FBI said, okay, step back from the equipment. You may not touch anything until you prove to us you're not polluting. Now that's called a hot shutdown. So think about this. 10 minutes after hot shutdown, it's a lot more dangerous than 10 minutes before hot shutdown. Because now that guy in that glove box drops that piece of plutonium, that nitric acid sits there in that container or in pipes and in tanks and so on, and nobody by law is allowed to work or to touch the equipment. Now, the contract lasted for another 6 years. That is, the federal contract lasted until 1995. So these people had to show up to work, many of whom were unionized, They had no choice. They had to show up, but they were literally not allowed to work. So they watched TV. They played cards. At least half of them did. The other half were going crazy trying to figure out how in the world do you take soil samples and test the air and so on. But nothing was done for 6 years. Well, next slide, Alan, shows you that nobody in the history of the world has ever cleaned up and closed a nuclear arsenal. Nobody knows what to do with this stuff, 26,000-year materials. And most importantly, it costs $700 million a year just to keep the fans running, keep security guards out there, keep the water flowing. Because you can't walk away, just leave this stuff there. You don't want anybody who's unauthorized to get access. So $700 million a year times 6 years, 1989 to 1995. That's a check for $4.2 billion and nothing is happening. So the Department of Energy said, look, we just can't continue to spend this kind of money. And since nobody's ever done this, there's no technology available to clean up and close a nuclear arsenal. What we got to do is bring a blue ribbon commission together, all the experts in the world, brought them together and essentially assigned them to give them an estimate. How long is it going to take and what's it going to cost to clean up and close Rocky Flats? Because George Herbert Walker Bush said, Cold War's over, we will never again produce nuclear weapons. So this is never going to be recreated, or the production is never going to start. All right, well, the estimate they gave was 70 years and $36 billion. So finished by the year 2065. Now, I interviewed the Secretary of Energy for the federal government. He said 70 years was a gross underestimate. We assumed it would take 200 years and hundreds of billions of dollars. But number one, Congress is not going to just give us a blank check. Number two, you can't send out an RFP for 200 years. Nobody will bid on that project. So we just picked 70. We're assuming we get somebody at least to tackle a project that's 70 years long. And sure enough, a company did it. And by the way, the photos there on that slide, the bottom photo shows you these barrels full of nitric acid and plutonium residues sitting on the prairie. That photo is taken at the 5-year mark. I mean, how long do you want that stuff to sit there, in the snow in the winter and the rust? That's probable. I mean, it's a dangerous place. Well, next slide. Alan, thank you. So through a competitive bidding process, a company got the contract. This company is privately held, but it's a competitor of Bechtel and Halliburton and those big firms that you've heard about before. And the photos simply show you it's just overwhelmed with the residues and the outcome of that production process, but it's just sitting there. All right, next slide. So this company who got the contract showed up in 1995 at the end of the old contract, the beginning of the new contract. And here's what they found. They found 21 tons of nuclear grade material. Now look, that's enough nuclear material to blow up the planet. I mean, it does not take 21 tons of nuclear grade material to blow up the Earth. It'd be like Star Wars. There's 100 tons in residue form. That's dust. So there's dust in the floor, in the walls, in the ductwork, in the ceiling, in the fixtures, in the furniture. So you have to clean up every square inch of 800 buildings, and including everything inside them. That photo you see on the right-hand side of the slide is a guy who's stripping concrete because you don't want to tear down a building if all the dust goes into the air. So you got to do all kinds of things in advance of any kind of real cleanup efforts. Well, a lot of this stuff you see 30,000 liters in solutions, tanks, pipes, some of them leaking, and so on. Nightline did a special calling this the most dangerous place in the North American continent. And there were, by the way, other sites in America that got estimates, but Rocky Flats was by far, and they admit this, by far the most polluted, the most dangerous. There's some of those rooms that were labeled infinity rooms. That is, they were sealed up, nobody was allowed in them, because when you put a monitoring device in the room, it went beyond infinity in terms of measuring the amount of radioactive pollution. Nobody was allowed in there. It was so dangerous. Anyway, it was a very, very dangerous place. Not easy to handle. All right, well, the next slide. The company that got the contract ended up knowing about, we'd spent 3 or 4 years with them before this occurred. They knew about positive practices. They knew about positive leadership. They were very serious about taking this whole set of activities and practices seriously. They finished the job 60 years early, $30 billion under budget. I mean, who do you know that's ever saved the federal government $30 billion? Most surprising to me, 13 times cleaner than required by federal standards. So it's become a wildlife refuge. You can now hold Girl Scout camps and picnics and whatnot out there. It'll never be housing developments. It'll always be a wildlife refuge, the only one on the eastern slope of the Rockies. So they brought buffalo and antelope out there, and it's a pristine, environmentally friendly place. Adversaries, protesters, antagonists became advocates and lobbyists. I mean, how do you turn your enemies into your friend? Active advocates. The labor relations, the Steelworkers Union said, this is the best labor relations I've ever seen in my life. And now we're laying off people as fast as we can. They're losing their jobs. And unions were enthusiastically involved in that. And that's just contrary to what most unions do, which is to preserve jobs. And so safety went from twice as bad to twice as good as the industry average. And in a very, very safe environment, you don't want any accidents with nuclear materials. Still 200 innovations. And the reason for that is there's no technology that allows you to do this. Nobody knew how to do it, so they had to invent their way through it. Anyway, the whole point, you see the photos where it was in 1995, where it is 10 years later in 2005. All right, next slide. What we're essentially saying is, even in these industries that are really, really tough, facing difficult situations, maybe more difficult than most of our organizations face. And you can't afford, if you're going to exceed the federal standard by a factor of 13, excuse me, you can't just be mediocre, and you can't just say, oh, well, we'll take a side trip and watch TV for a while and have barbecues every Saturday afternoon, and it's just going to be happyology. Not so. Rather, it was an incredibly, I think, successful, dramatically successful implementation of what we refer to as positive leadership. So next slide, Alan, and I'm almost finished.
Are we ready to do a quick poll?
Sure, that's perfect. Let's do that. Thank you.
Yep, all right. So we're going to keep going. So what percentage of leadership books are based on validated empirical evidence? We can get that poll going. The votes are coming in. I'll give you another 15 seconds. Keep going. We're past half voters. We have a highly engaged audience today, so that's great to see. We had great participation in the last poll. Keep going, folks. Keep going, a couple more. Let's break our records. Let's get to like 90%. Let's get everybody engaged. All right, so let's close the poll, get the result. Kim, you want to back to you?
How interesting. As it turns out, this is, look, if you log on to Amazon.com, in fact, flip to the next slide. I think I may have a slide that shows this evidence, Alan. If you log on to Amazon.com, you're going to find 190,000 books on leadership. We do not need one more. Well, about 1,000 are added to that list every month, and the average book, interestingly, sells 65 copies or less. That was from my book publisher of some of the things that we've published around here. So once you get through family and friends, I mean, that's essentially it. But what's interesting is I don't know the percent exactly, but a very small percent, I would say far less than 10% of the books on leadership report validated empirical evidence. Most of them are storytelling. Most of them are inspirational events. Most of them are, here's what I did when I was a leader, I'm sure it'll work for you, or here's what I've observed, or these are the principles that have been especially helpful for me. But evidence-based practice, really carefully constructed, validated data is just pretty rare. Well, who cares? As it turns out, leaders account for between 20 and 30% of the variance or the outcome of the performance of organizations. Now, look, strategy matters a lot. Culture matters a lot. Incentive systems, processes. I mean, there's a lot of things that matter a lot. But if all of those are in place and you got an absolute jerk for a leader, probably not going to work. So leaders, of course, are not by any means the only important factor. It's just that they're the single most important factor. So when we give advice to leaders, when we give direction, when we say, you know, you should do it this way, there ought to be evidence that it pays off because it matters so much. I mean, it really does pay off. So what we do, what I do, what I'm really very serious about is when we give advice to leaders, there ought to be evidence that it actually pays off. So most of the time, in fact, you can flip that next slide, Alan. I make promises that there are 3 criteria we always use, especially when it relates to positive practices and positive leadership, because it can be misinterpreted as soupy, syrupy, touchy-feely, saccharine sweet baloney. So number 1 is there has to be empirical evidence that it pays off. No prescriptions can be just, well, it sounds good to me, it must work. Number 2 is there has to be a theory that explains why it works. See, if you have a headache and I give you an aspirin and it takes away your headache, well, that's not black magic. We know why that works. There's a theory. That's what theories do, is explain why it works. And then number 3, I either have to have done this or helped an organization do it. That is, I have seen that there's practical utility. Those 3 promises are attached to this whole field of positive leadership and positive organization scholarship. So we ensure that it's just not airport bookstore advice or not just consultants' advice. There's something scientific and solid about this. So the next slide, Alan, and we're almost finished. My own research has asked the question for the last 15 years or so. All right, look, does this actually pay off in organizations, a broad variety of organizations? Because, in fact, Alan mentioned just before we started that there was a question that already had been submitted. How's this related to Marty Seligman and his positive psychology movement and so on? Most of those people are very good friends of mine. In fact, I'm on the executive committee of the International Positive Psychology Association. And I don't do psychology, but positive psychology has essentially subsumed organizational science, which is just fine with me. It doesn't matter a bit, because many of us rely on some of the very important foundational research studies that kind of highlight the importance of positive practices, positive dynamics. Positive psychology focuses mainly on attitudes and emotions, and to some extent more and more positive physiology. Positive organizations ask the questions, okay, I get it, when you get exposed to virtuous positive practices, it actually affects your brain waves, your heart rhythms, and so on. But we can get a lot of positive people in a room, a lot of happy folks. It does not make for a great organization. So that's been my question. What happens in organizations when you implement positive practices? The conclusion, and this is our last slide, after 15 years, and so far, by the way, there's unequivocal evidence. Thus far, no contrary data. If you implement positive practices, or sometimes what I refer to as creating an abundance culture, that's a whole nother discussion, but these positive practices when you implement them, and simply compare when we're implementing these things and we can see a change or an improvement. So we're trying to get at causality. If things change, what happens a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later to outcomes? And the conclusions are, number one, you will earn more money, substantially higher levels of profitability when you implement positive practices versus not. Productivity, significantly higher. Quality, significantly higher. Less waste, fewer errors, fewer mistakes. Innovation, significantly higher. Customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, customer retention, significantly higher. And, of course, employee engagement, employee morale, employee retention, significantly higher. Those are things we're held accountable for. And as it turns out, positive leadership, positive practices enhance significantly those outcomes that organizations need to make certain that they maximize, or at least optimize. So, Alan, let me stop. I'm taking a little bit too long, but I wanted to make sure at least we got through the data that seems to suggest, without details at all, seems to suggest that actually this matters. And it matters in areas where we're held accountable.
So, Kim, if we could clear your calendar and keep this thing going for about 4 more hours, I think we would.
I would love it.
We could unpack this topic a little further. Folks, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box for Dr. Kim Cameron from the University of Michigan. And Kim, you talked about in your books, organizational culture is one of the most important predictors of high levels of performance over time. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Culture is a crucial factor, and it was so well illustrated. I loved your illustration about those fish in the bowl, Alan, because culture is the sort of it's the water, it's the dirty water in which we exist. And you know the old adage, fish discover water last. I mean, they're in water, they don't know they're in water. Similarly, my guess is, I don't know who really is on the line, but my guess is the majority of us, if we live in the United States, did not wake up today saying to ourselves, I think maybe I'll speak English today. I mean, we don't even know we do until we encounter somebody who does not. So culture, for the most part, is implicit, just taken for granted until we encounter something that's countercultural. So if we're going to make a change, I mean, I can make a behavior change, but your illustration is perfect. I can make a behavior change. I go right back in that culture. I still speak English, you know. So I've got to tackle the culture. And we've created a little framework, a little model. It's the most used model in the world to measure and to highlight what the key aspects of organization culture are. And it's frequently the case that you can't change it unless you have a sense of what it is first. I mean, you can't lose weight until you know how much you weigh. So we measure, monitor, identify key aspects of culture, and then help organizations try to address that or tackle that. And in particular, tackle it from the standpoint of implementing positive practices. Now, that's a very general kind of high-level explanation, but your illustration is the very best one I've seen, Alan.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Kim. And folks, keep the questions pouring in. We're on to a little hot button issue, Kim, on culture, and I will give you a plug. And I mentioned this in my opening, that you have the #1 framework that is used in diagnosing organizational culture, and that's something we'd be happy to share and go deeper with others. But we have a question from Matt, and it's why then, based on your last comment, Kim, Matt asks, why then do so many companies settle for or support leaders who create the exact opposite leadership climate or culture, one of fear and negativity?
Boy, it is so true, and I don't know for sure. I think I'm sort of gratified by more and more companies taking this seriously, but most of us have experienced organizations where they're just cranky curmudgeons and power-hungry folks at the top, and so on. Now, here's what I think. Now, I don't have empirical evidence that this is the case at all, but from the time, here's one of the ways I think about it. From the time we were small, all of us in the crib, we learned pay attention to negative feedback. Otherwise, it could be dangerous. So ignore the sense of falling, ignore loud noises, walk across the street and ignore the sound of screeching tires. I mean, life's over or significantly affected. But if I miss a pleasant experience in my life, well, I missed a little pleasure, but life's not over. I mean, it's not even significantly affected. So from the time I was very, very small, I learned pay attention to negative feedback. And by the time I'm this age, man, I'm really good at it. It's the first thing I look at, first thing I see. Otherwise, it could be dangerous. So I tend over time to learn myself out of a positive perspective. And not only do I ignore it, I now negatively define it as soupy and syrupy and, touchy-feely and Pollyanna-ish and so on. So at least some of us have over time said, I got to handle problems, and if I handle problems well, that means I'm going to be a success. So the whole world becomes a problem, and it's a kind of a negative perspective. It takes a certain amount of courage, in my view, to say, no. Even though I'm challenged, even though I lost $70 million this year, I'm not going to take a look at it as just a set of problems. I'm going to look at it at what we can do rather than what we don't do, and so on. The kind of Jim Malazzi quotation, So I don't know for sure why individuals and organizations have such a bias toward the negative, but they certainly do. This positive orientation is often negatively defined and irrelevant. They define it as irrelevant. I think the evidence is exactly the opposite. And that's why I think we need to spend so much time giving people evidence, because it's not intuitive initially.
So Kim, let's pick up on that. And by the way, there's a lot of questions coming in. They're great, and I'm going to categorize. But here's a specific picking up right on that. And I'm not going to share the name for obvious reasons here. How can positive leadership be applied with a team of marketing employees that has just been informed of their change in executive management, and the new leader is totally the opposite of his vision from what they have been used to? And so I think you sort of answered it in your prior, and I'm wondering if you could give us one specific example. You have models, you have frameworks, you have tools. Can you give this person a piece of specific advice? Because a number of the questions are, can you give me a concrete example? And I know from the book, by the way, to everybody, there's just example after example on the book on practicing positive leadership is filled with these. Could you give us one, Kim, for our marketing team?
Sure. There is. I wish I had enough time to talk about these. And I think if there was a silver bullet, we'd have all learned about it and practiced it. So I think there is not such a thing as a silver bullet, but there is a practice. There's a tool, and I refer to it. The name I use is supportive communication, which has a number of attributes. One of which is something called descriptive communication rather than evaluative communication. Now, what does that mean? So, descriptive communication means that when I encounter an issue or problem or have to give someone negative feedback or corrective feedback, there are 3 steps. Number 1 is describe as accurately and as objectively as you can what just happened, what the event is. I noticed that when you walked in today, I'm going to make this up. I noticed that when you walked in today, you didn't smile at anybody, you went directly to your office. That's just an objective statement of fact. Number 2, here's my reaction, or here's the consequence of that activity. It just I noticed everybody was smiling when you walked in, but now they're not. Kind of took all the air out of our balloon. Step number 3. Here's a suggested alternative that would be more acceptable, or that would be better. So, when you walk by, if you maybe stop, let's just connect with each other just for a few minutes. I think it would matter a lot. A better example, the example may take too long, but I graduated from college on Friday, got married on Monday. I stayed for a master's degree, and I was staying up, I had to write a master's thesis, so I stayed up late at night. And the way I'd stay awake, I'd eat toast and Cheerios and fruit and stuff. And at 2 a.m. in the morning, 3 a.m. in the morning, I didn't want to do the dishes, so I just left them there on the counter. Well, my brand new wife would wake up in the morning, and here's these dirty dishes on the counter. I mean, just started her day off terribly. So she could have said, well, you're kind of messy. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. I mean, we'd have argued. Or you don't care about me. Of course I care about you. No, you don't. Yes, I do. So evaluative communication is you're wrong, you're bad. If you just change, everything will be better. So it's not that, it's descriptive. Second step is it just starts my day off wrong. That's my reaction to it. It's kind of just a negative start to the day. Step 3, if you just put them in the sink, you don't have to do the dishes. Just wipe off the counter, put them in the sink. That would make me feel better. Now we discuss acceptable alternatives, not who's right and wrong. All right, now flip the example. So what if I have a boss who's a curmudgeon, who's a hot dog, who's power hungry, or who makes life miserable? Those steps can still be used. It takes courage, but I'm not going to blame. I'm not going to evaluate. I'm not going to, verbally crucify somebody. I'm simply going to say, let me tell you what I observed. Let me tell you what I think the results are, or at least my reaction to that. Now, there's no reason to argue with any of that. The third is the hardest step. Here's a suggested alternative. And it now becomes a problem-solving discussion rather than a who's right, who's wrong discussion. I've seen that work upwards as well as downwards because most people don't want to go around defending everybody they can, encounter. They really do want to have performance be higher. Now, I don't know if that's relevant at all, Alan, but that's one of multiple tools.
Yeah, that was very, very helpful. So we're probably getting close to the end, but maybe we could take one more question. And
sure.
The question is for leaders to lead change, you say that leaders must create readiness and overcome resistance. And we're wondering, people are writing about sort of this negativity, but the idea of how well do you believe leaders do or accomplish these first couple stages of creating readiness and overcoming resistance? Just want your opinion on how well, and then maybe one tip for people for helping to change people when driving or thinking about driving change.
Yeah, there's just a little model. It's a model or a tool or a framework for helping change occur. 5 steps, create readiness, a bunch of ways to do that. I'll mention one. Overcome resistance, because there are always blockers. Anytime you change a comfort zone, you're going to get resistance. Number 3 is articulating a vision, but not any vision. Most organizations have visions, but nobody cares, frankly. So this is a vision of abundance, something that helps people raise their aspirations and create profound purpose. And then create commitment, generate commitment, and then foster sustainability so you don't have to keep doing this over and over. Those are the 5 steps. But creating readiness, there are a whole bunch of ways to do that. One positive way is to pay close attention to the language that's used. Simply, I'll give you a quick example. Back when Disney was just Disney, I just saw they bought 20th Century Fox Entertainment, so it's an incredibly large corporation. But back when it was just 4 businesses: real estate, retail, movies, and theme parks. When you were hired by Disney, you were not hired by the Human Resources Department. What's the name of the department that hired people? It was called Central Casting. And you didn't wear a costume. You didn't wear a uniform. You wore a costume. You didn't go work. You didn't even go to work. You went on stage. And you didn't take a break. You went off stage. And in fact, if you said, "Oh, time for a break," no, we're going off stage, they'd fine you $1. Now, why in the world would you do that? It's because you're taking a bunch of high school kids, turning them into the best service providers in the world. Well, how do you do that? You put them in show business. Even if you're selling snow cones or sweeping up the park, you got a role in our show, you got a script, you got a costume. You're in show business. You matter as much as the person who's on stage. And so one option, I've seen this happen so many times in organizations, including my friend Malazzi in Prudential, who one of the very first things he did was he changed the incentive system. He assigned every single person in his organization, now we're talking about tens of thousands, every single person in his organization was required to positively embarrass somebody every day. What does that mean? That means compliment somebody in front of somebody else who cares. And he had some people say it's kind of uncomfortable, it's kind of silly, it's kind of trivial. He said, I don't care. If you've positively embarrassed somebody every day, you're going to start thinking about what we're doing as opposed to what we're not. You're going to forget about the 70 million in the red, and you're going to start thinking about how we can capitalize on things that are going well and who ought to be congratulated. It's going to change the whole way we think about things. He just changed the language or what we were saying in that organization. And it's one of the small things, but it's just one, creating readiness to do something else that's better. Now, that's a lot of babbling, and I don't know whether or not that's relevant at all, but there's a long list.
Yeah. Well, and the good news is that all of those things, as well as questions about where is there research and more research across large numbers, all of these things are taught. They're not only covered in your book, Kim, Practicing Positive Leadership, Tools and Techniques that Create Extraordinary Results. So you teach so many in that book. It's just packed with models and frameworks and tools. And for those that want to try the CorpU experience, so like we said, we have thousands and thousands of people have taken our 3-week Practicing Positive Leadership program from Kim Cameron and our partner at the University of Michigan. For those that want to experience it, you can reach out to your CorpU representative, and we'll run an event on April 22nd through the 26th. So as you know, the standard CorpU, it's a 1-week short version, so it's kind of an open program for people to take a look. It's Monday through Thursday, 30 minutes a day. You do it at your own time or pace or place, so that is asynchronous. And then Friday on April 26th will be a 1-hour live event where we unpack what occurred during that week. So it's a 3-hour course, 1 week long. It's part of component part of the 3-week Practicing Positive Leadership program. We also have other programs that come from Kim and other faculty from the Center for Positive Organizations at Michigan Ross School. And I think I'm going to close by thanking Kim and just letting everybody know that in next month in April, Lars Christensen from Agilent, who is a role model positive leader, has built an award-winning organization. They just won a big award from Gartner for talent payback and success. So that's coming up next month for our Smarter Growth webinar series, building off of what you've done for us today. Kim, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciated it, everything. We have a great audience today that was really deeply engaged. So thank you again for everything you do for the practice and for all of our folks today.
Alan, thank you. You're a hero. I appreciate very much being involved. Thanks so much.
Yep. Thank you again. Thank you all. And everybody make it a great day and a great week. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.